So I got into filmmaking primarily because I felt like it was an extremely useful and effective way to bring forward critical analysis and do popular education. I think documentary is widely accessible, and it is a means that are at people's disposition quite easily, and it's a way for people to take in information quickly, and I think in a very accessible way when you're dealing with big topics. So for me, where I was at in my life in 2006, 2007, when I made the switch over into documentary, I had been really involved in some grassroots initiatives. At the time, I was very involved in the anti-war movement. I was involved in a group here in Montreal called Block the Empire. And at the time, we were doing a lot of work around Canada's involvement in Afghanistan, and as well as the occupation in Iraq. And I was shocked to find out that there was no documentary that tackled the subject of Canadian imperialism and Canada's military industrial complex and the war profiteering that Canada's involved in. And it was that kind of realization that there wasn't a documentary on the subject, and that there was a big gap. There was definitely a need from my involvement in the anti-war movement, where I could see that I thought, oh, well, you know what, this might be a really great way as an organizer and as a popular educator to kind of merge my activism as well as having some, artistic project. And so it just seemed to make sense at the time, because I very much felt like there was a reason. And since then, what I've realized is that there's a lot of important topics in terms of the ways the world works that I believe I have the capacity to bring forward in a documentary to help people kind of connect the dots. And as Paulo Freire, the grandfather of popular education, says, where people can have those aha moments. And so for me, since then, documentary has been a way to bring forward critical analysis, particularly around topics that I think need to have an anti-capitalist and anti-colonialist perspective. So the Carbon Rush is a global expose that looks at the impact of the carbon market directly on communities that are impacted by carbon offset projects. So essentially what the carbon market is it's a way to give a monetary value to 1 ton of carbon. And on an international level, this market is kind of been the main way to mitigate carbon emissions. And so there's been a huge carbon offset project database set up, and where there would be these green projects or supposed green projects that are created and set up, and where people could buy carbon credits that'll support these projects in order that they can continue to pollute and maintain their carbon emissions. So what the film does is go and explores that and says, okay, well, let's go and actually look at these projects on the ground and see how it actually affects the communities that live with these projects. So we visit projects in India, in Brazil, in Panama, in Honduras. And unfortunately, throughout the film, we learned that not only are these projects not reducing carbon emissions, but they're also having devastating impacts on the community, where not only are we seeing displacements of communities or them losing their livelihood, but even in some extreme cases like in Honduras, where we're seeing dozens of people getting assassinated, and funded directly from these carbon offset projects. So it definitely raises questions around what are real solutions to mitigate carbon emissions, and if we're going to tackle climate change, that this is certainly not the way to go about it. So I get a lot of motivation, a lot of inspiration from my films, from I guess allies and collaborators who I've been lucky enough over the last 6 years to work with. And I get a lot of inspiration and motivation from public, from people who have seen my projects. And I get told after every screening that I go to by at least one person, if not many, that they learned something from my films that they didn't know. that they didn't know the impact of the carbon market, and that they're outraged at how this is essentially a multi-billion-dollar scam and how capitalism is destroying the planet. I get told regularly by people that they watched Myths for Profit and really helping them develop their analysis and understand things, or, you know, the images and the words were expressions that they had been thinking, but they hadn't necessarily articulated, and that it's been helping them in their ability to articulate those ideas. And so by getting that kind of encouragement and feedback from my project, it continues to inspire me to keep going. And in terms of why documentary rather than another medium, it goes to more of my initial answer of, you know, documentary is a medium where literally you can have a small kitchen gathering, living room gathering of 10 friends and watch a documentary and have a discussion group. Or you can, you know, as Cinema Politica does in chapters all over the world, have, you know, hundreds of people come together and watch a political documentary and then have a discussion after. Or it's going to be something that people are going to download on their computer and watch. You know, it's a medium where people who want to learn can find a topic and learn quickly and fast, and often in an entertaining way. And that really resonates because we're not getting our critical analysis from our schools. We're certainly not getting them from corporate media. And so it's extremely important that independent documentary continue, because I just hear from so many people that that's how they learned about certain ideas, or those were, you know, the sparks that helped them connect dots. And so many people who watch documentary that take that information and then transform that into action, because that's what knowledge does. You can know things and then a few weeks later be at a demonstration or be in a situation, and those memories of what you learned from the documentary will come back to you, and that will just propel you, I believe, into continuing to be an engaged person in the world who tries to transform it into a better place for everybody. Documentary is one tool, and I think it's a tool that's very useful. I just finished a new documentary that's called No Land, No Food, No Life. We're waiting on the news on where our world premiere is. Hopefully sometime in the early fall, we're going to be having our world premiere. It's a global expose that looks at agricultural land grabs and the impact that land grabs are having on small-scale subsistence-based farmers around the world. So the film takes us from Cambodia and Mali and Uganda to look at farmers whose lands have been stolen for different reasons by large multinational or national interests, and that have transformed these subsistence scale farmers' land into you know, big agribusiness projects, what the reality's been, and how this is again another you know, guise that's being brought forward of saying that this is development and helping farmers, but in fact we're seeing farmers who had functioning systems of autonomy, where they could get their energy, they could get their food, they had functioning systems, where now those systems are no longer functioning and they're broken. So they are dependent now for food, they are dependent now for energy, and they've been essentially transformed from autonomous farmers to exploited workers. And how after millennia where these lands have been, you know, worked by generations, farmers are now no longer owned and run by these farmers, but now by agribusiness. So the film is called No Land, No Food, No Life, and we're just going to release it. It's going to be screened on Tele-Quebec in the fall, as well as Super Channel in the fall, and we're hoping to do a great run in festivals. I realize that right now, when we're talking about support and distribution of documentary, we're in a time where it's very challenging whether you're an emerging filmmaker or an established filmmaker, because the traditional models that had been put in place over the past 50 years are changing, are being destroyed, and there's just less funds to go around. I do think, from my understanding, that it's more difficult for established filmmakers who are coming from generations of working within that model. I think for people who are new to filmmaking or who are, more understanding of the fact that we don't live with any stability with our lives, that it's less, I guess, shocking or difficult on an emotional or mental basis. And this isn't to discredit and say that things are easy, but just that maybe how people might cope with it. I get a lot of inspiration from crowdfunding and community-supported projects that we're seeing with platforms like Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I see a lot of documentaries where they're getting a lot of support from grassroots groups or not-for-profit organizations who want to make sure that advocacy projects can get done. So yes, it's changing. I think I think it's changing less for filmmakers who do the type of projects that I do, because my documentaries are niche documentaries to begin with. I do critical, anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist films. That's not going to be something necessarily very, palatable for broadcasters or traditional funders to begin with. I never expected the Canadian government to film a documentary called Miss for Profit, Canada's Role in Industries of War and Peace. They're going to be very critical of the Canadian state. So that was never going to be my apprehension, and I'm not surprised to not, receive funding necessarily for those type of projects. I'm a huge supporter of the work that Cinema Politica does. I attend their screenings religiously. I come every week because I really think as a filmmaker, I take to heart Stephen King's advice that he gave to writers, where he said, if you want to write, you have to read. And I take that to heart, where if you're going to make political documentaries, you have to watch political documentaries. So it's a gift to live in Montreal and have the base of Cinema Politica be here in Montreal, where at the Hall building at Concordia, we literally have hundreds of people come out every week, and there's filmmakers and lots of very interesting people that come out every week for the debates or what have you. But I also know communities, where Cinema Politica in small communities is really the only access to any kind of new political art form, and it's so needed in smaller communities as well, not just the bigger cities where we have the luxuries we do here in Montreal. And so for me, as a filmmaker who has their films distributed in the Cinema Politica network, I'm so encouraged that it keeps growing, and so disheartened that it's not getting the support it needs to grow even more, because there's a snowball, and the only thing that's stopping it is resources. And so for me, Cinema Politica is one of the most amazing projects that exist, and I really think everyone should be getting behind it. I think there's really interesting intersections that happen between art and politics. I think Cinema Politica is a great example. Some of the smaller communities that might exist in, no one saw it as a threat, because you're saying you're organizing a weekly documentary night, and no one sees that as necessarily controversial. Be it through this art form, people are getting exposed to all kinds of ideas, all kinds of movers and shakers that are trying to transform the world, and the people who are watching these films are having revelations, and that transforms them. So in terms of the intersection between art and activism or politics, documentary is really one of the mediums that I think that you get to really play with the creative form, right? There's so many ways you can make a documentary, while at the same time bringing forward ideas that are shaped the world that we live in. And then that's what politics is, right? Our engagement and our way of understanding the world.